What can science tell us about animal minds? So over the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to do my best to answer this question. But first I'll give a little introduction to myself. So I'm Ben Farrar, and I am a scientist trying to tell you about animal minds. I work with these birds over here, Eurasian jays. But I've really, over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, lost faith in science's ability to tell us a great deal about animal minds. As this has stemmed from criticisms within science, so looking at bias and reliability of scientific methods, but also some criticisms from outside of science. And it's this sort of borderland between science and non-science that I want to focus on in today's talk. So I'm going to start by presenting quite a naive split between science and non-science from the perspective of a scientist, and say that the scientific mantra really is that through experiments and statistics, we're going to tell you the facts about animal minds. And if you look in the scientific literature, it's not too hard to find elements of this approach really coming out. So here we have a couple of quotes from the animal welfare literature. It's all the more important to objectively assess cows on their own terms, or there are various components that can be used to contribute to the objective assessment of an animal's welfare. So this belief is really out there that this scientific method is the way to gradually converge on things that are just true about animals. And you can see this in the headlines of the scientific literature. There are strong, bold, general statements about animal cognition. Crows rival monkeys in cognitive capacity. Apes understand false beliefs. Bees understand the concept of zero. And to any outsider who's not going to dig deep into these papers, this is the science of animal cognition. But the question is, why or when should we believe these claims? Can a single study tell us that bees understand the concept of zero? And if it can, why can it? So to have a look at why, or why scientists say we should believe them, we're going to look a little bit inside the scientific process now. We're going to see that a scientific claim normally rests upon two separate claims, a statistical claim and a theoretical claim. So the statistical claim is just a statement about what animals do, or what animals did. So they're going to say, in this task that we gave the animals, this is how they performed, this is what they did. And then from the statistical claim, they'll work towards a more general theoretical claim, which says that animal cognition works in a certain way. So you move from the statistical, animals did this in our experiment, to the theoretical, animals do this in general because their cognition works in this way. For example, you might see a statistical claim that monkeys inspect parts of their body more that they can't see when they're in front of a mirror than when they're in front of a non-mirror. And from this statistical thing, this observation that monkeys inspect parts of their faces that they can't see in mirrors, people might move to the theoretical claim that they're capable of self-recognition, or they have some form of self-consciousness. Or alternatively, you might see a claim about dogs and that they might be very good at remembering the location of hidden toys. And this might lead people to suggest, okay, well, maybe they have a human-like memory, an episodic-like memory. They might be mentally replaying previous events to remember where their bone was hidden. But of course, these chains of reasoning aren't perfect. It doesn't necessarily follow that because monkeys inspect invisible parts of their faces more in front of a mirror than a non-mirror, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are capable of self-recognition or have self-consciousness. And simply just because a dog might be very good at remembering where an item is, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has a sort of episodic-like memory, a human-like memory. So this is the first part where these scientific claims can sort of fall down. There might be quite a strong disconnect between the statistics of what these animals have done and the theory on the other side. And this is going to be a problem for all your big, strong, general statements about animal cognition in the literature. It's going to be very rare that they're actually matched by a sufficient statistical model of the animal behaviour to warrant the claim. And some scientists tend to be pretty good at pointing out when these chains of reasoning fall down. If you delve into any scientific literature, yes, you will find these big, bold statements about animal cognition, but you will also find some counter perspectives and some caveats going on here, criticizing the method, saying, okay, well, just because the animals did that in this experiment, it doesn't necessarily mean that their cognition works in a certain way. Maybe these other reasons could explain the experimental results. And this can be our first big problem out navigating the scientific borderlands. It can be quite hard to work out what science is actually claiming. If you're relatively interested in scientific research into animal cognition and you read a few papers, you might read the press releases, you might listen to some talks, you're still only seeing a highly filtered version of what the scientific community is actually talking about. So these big general bold claims have to be taken with a little grain of salt most of the time. And unless you can be confident that the theoretical claim is quite closely matched by the statistical model used by the scientists, then the ability of science to constrain your beliefs about animal cognition is really, really diminished. So this is a problem, and I guess it's kind of quite straightforward. It's going to be probably pretty unlikely that any one scientific study is going to be able to tell you if apes understand false beliefs or if bees are capable of understanding the concept of zero. But this brings us on to the next big problem about scientific evidence about animal cognition, is that often these statistical claims might not be true either. So what might it mean for a statistical result to be true, or perhaps robust is a better word there? Well, we might want it to be reliable, and we might want it to be general. So if we run the same experiment again, we might want to get roughly the same results. If we make a general statement about dog or bird behavior, we might want it to generalize across most of this population of interest. Now, the problem is that in psychology and related subjects, successful replication rates seem to be quite low. So here you have two replication rates in human psychology of around 50%. So these are two big groups, they try and replicate lots of studies, and they're only seeing about 50% of them replicating successfully. So this is a problem. If we can only trust 50% of our statistical findings, then a lot of the literature then becomes highly questionable. What the current status of this in animal cognition is, we don't know. Personally, I think there's a lot of indicators of quite low reliability, but until we perform these replication studies, we're really not going to have a great idea. And perhaps one of the shocking things is that replications that are supposedly this cornerstone of scientific practice seem to be quite rare. So a recent analysis of primate cognition studies showed that only around 2% of primate cognition studies are replication studies. So we really don't know the reliability of our own findings often. And this should have quite severe consequences for our trust in the scientific claims that we see coming out of the literature. So if only around 50–60% of the statistical claims are to be believed, and then if only a minority of the theoretical claims after that make sense, then your likelihood of stumbling across any single solid study becomes very, very small quite quickly. And the likelihood of your headlines that you're reading to be true, that are filled with all the hype and the media spin to get attention, of being even remotely related to what the science actually says, is pretty slim. So you might ask, how have we got into this position? How are we in a position where I'm saying, well, actually, we probably shouldn't trust a lot of the literature about animal cognition? And I think the answer comes down to this disconnect in the incentives between what will be good for society as a whole and what's good for the individual scientist. So scientists are judged based on metrics like the number of publications and the number of citations they have and whether they can get into these top tier journals. And to do this, they're really looking for the results to be sold with, to be the importance of the results to be highlighted and exaggerated. Whereas what might be good for society is if scientists are a little bit more careful about the results. They don't jump hastily to conclusions. They don't fish around in their data and look for significance and things like this. So it's a very sort of stereotypical biased story going on. And I think quite a nice analogy to have is between science, art, and illusions. So on the next slide, we're going to have a little look about the analogy we might be able to pull between these scientific results we're seeing and pieces of art or illusions and tricks. So at this point, I wanted to show you a video. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get the video to work, but it was a video of a trick shot, of a basketball trick shot, which is the highest ever basketball hoop made. You can see in the picture in the middle here a big apartment block, and the people who do the trick shot, they go to the top of this really, really tall apartment block with a basketball, throw it off, and the ball inevitably finds its way through a hoop at the very bottom on the ground. It's pretty cool. And I just want to think, and you can see loads of these videos on YouTube. If you just type in trick shots, you can see all the wonderful and amazing events that people have managed to capture on camera. And I just want to think, what might some of the parallels be between these trick shot videos that we see on YouTube and artwork and illusions and the output of our scientific papers on animal minds. So here are some of the parallels that I think we can draw between trick shots and artwork and illusions and science. In most cases, there's quite a lot of planning that goes involved. The trick shotters plan, okay, what's going to look really cool to our target audience. Scientists also plan, okay, well, what's going to look the most convincing to our journals and our readers. Then there's a big setup involved. Scientists spend ages on experimental design, designing the perfect experiment for their animals. trick shotters do this as well, and artists do this. They spend a lot of time planning out what it's going to look like and setting everything up, pulling in all the resources they need. And then the key thing for both really is that you don't see the outtakes. So this is obvious in trick shots. If you see someone throw a basketball from 1,000 feet and it goes through a hoop, okay, of course they didn't get that first time. It might have been 10,000 attempts that they took. Less known is this happens quite a bit in science as well, and we call it publication bias, is that in some research programs, scientists are only really incentivized to publish the positive results. And all of a sudden, if you don't know how many outtakes there are, if you don't know how many negative the results were for every single positive result, then we're in no place to really quantify the strength of the evidence that they provide. And this is one of the big limitations and why we get tricked by trick shots, or why we think they're so impressive, and also why we can get tricked by science, is that we only see the end point. And the scientists or the stunt people, the trick shotters, are always in control of what this endpoint is. So with this in mind, we want to ask, how can we best navigate the scientific borderlands? How can we as scientists on one hand demonstrate the reliability and credibility of our findings? And how can non-specialists on the other hand interact with a scientific research field which is potentially facing a large crisis of credibility and reliability in its findings? And I think that there are two options. Now, option one, which I think is the less preferable one, is just to say that the scientific study of animals needs to be more scientific. We need more reliability, less bias, and to double down on this science, non-science border and really say, okay, well, if science is going to be getting these facts, then we have to be super, super objective. But I think it was blind faith in objectivity and our statistical methods and our ability to scientifically study the minds of animals that's kind of got us in this place in the first place. And option two is a little bit more of a considered approach. One that says we just want to understand bias in science, in animal research. Okay, so there's never going to be a view from nowhere when we're looking at things like animal minds. But what we might want to do is assess and maybe mitigate some of the biases that we know crop up in the scientific processes. And this does require addressing the reliability issues and the credibility issues. But I think there's a bigger project in there as well. And this is really to find what a healthy role of science within animal studies actually looks like. What questions do we want science to tackle, and what information do we want science to provide? How can science and how should science constrain our beliefs about animals? And this is kind of what I want to leave open now for the discussion, if we want to go into that later. But I'm just going to close by saying that I haven't gone into a lot of the details of how to assess and mitigate reliability in science. If you are interested in that, we have a couple of papers out there. There's this one which focuses mainly on reliability in the field of comparative cognition, and this paper on scientific bias in animal studies in comparative or the field of comparative cognition. And I just want to end with a small caveat. So a lot of my things are saying, okay, well, we really, really need to question the reliability and credibility of science's research findings when it comes to a lot of animal studies, and particularly in my area of interest about animal minds. But this shouldn't be something, concerns about scientific credibility and reliability doesn't mean that all science in this area is bad. There are some really, really high quality pieces of work. I would say that they're incredibly difficult to identify. I think even for myself, and from an outsider's perspective especially, it's going to be very, very difficult to separate what looks strong and what doesn't look strong without really, really going down into the mechanisms of, okay, well, what have these scientists done over the last 10, 15 years, and should we trust the output of it? So I think you need a lot of private knowledge and a lot of research to understand the credibility of individual research findings. But again, this doesn't mean that a reliable and credible science isn't possible. It absolutely is, and there will be some very reliable and very credible findings in there as well. So that's everything from me. I just want to say thanks for listening. There's my contact details on the bottom of the slide if you want to get in touch, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.